Hello and welcome back to David Galata's Book Dreamer. That's me. I'm David Galata. I'm the Book Dreamer. Yes, that's right. I'm that crazy guy who all of his books are based on his dreams. All right then. That's all taken care of. Yes, I am the author of Crew of Ganges, which is the first volume of the Crucible Spirals trilogy. And I am also the author of Favored Son, a standalone fantasy that is very satirical, very sarcastic, whose anti-hero is a wastrel, beggar, thief, and conman. Yes, indeed. These are the books that I like to write. I like to write things that are a little skewed in oblique directions. I'm not very into current events and current fashions and fads. That doesn't really. eh, No, no. I've seen them come. I've seen them go. I've seen them stick around. It's interesting, the ones that stick around. And that is, in a way, the topic of today. Today is all about alternate histories in science fiction and fantasy. This is a beloved subgenre. And what's interesting about it is that it is not just a subgenre of science fiction, but it's also a subgenre of fantasy. This makes it an ambassador between those two genres, and some people lump them together. Science fiction, fantasy, it's all fantastical fiction, it's all imaginative kind of stuff. Now, one is very much based on science and based on what could be possible based on what we know about science. So science fiction changes and evolves just like our sciences are supposed to do, and they do, slowly but surely they do. Whereas fantasy does not have to be grounded in anything real. So when we come to alternate histories, we're kind of skating that edge between the two. And that's what's exciting about it. Alternate histories can be seen in many ways. For example, in science fiction, it could have to do with time travel. So maybe someone went back in time and they changed something, and suddenly events that didn't occur do occur, and things that should have happened or did happen before don't happen. Certain people aren't born, and yeah, don't go back in time and try to kill your ancestors because you won't be there to go back in time to do it. So yes, science fiction does have that. Fantasy, again, one of my favorite authors, Michael Moorcock, who wrote Elric of Melniboné and Gloriana, amongst other, Mother London, which I highly recommend. His characters come from different universes. They may even be the same people, but they're all from different universes that had very different physics, very different timelines, very different histories. And that is part of fantasy. Where they meet and where alternate histories can become an ambassador between science fiction and fantasy is in the multiverse itself. Now, we've seen a little bit of that with Marvel, and they're having fun with the idea. Um, and whether or not they're accurate, that's a whole different thing, because we're dealing with comic books, which is another wonderful ambassador between science fiction and fantasy. Not all of the superheroes have their powers particularly explained well. Some of them seem very fantastical. Others are highly scientific. Either which way, they're a stretch of the imagination, and they make you stretch your disbelief beyond all bounds. And that's cool. It also is a nice ambassador, but I'm not talking graphic novels today. I'm not talking about comic books in particular. I am talking about alternate histories. For example, you could have uh, a history whereby, what if Rome never fell? And that's one that I've played around a little bit with in my book, Tales from the Age of Unity, which is technically a science fiction. It is based on the ship. Whoops, that's how I knock things over. Crew of Ganges. It's based on this ship. And yet I found a way of tucking in the idea What would have happened if Rome hadn't fallen? If Rome had continued and grew technologically? And there I focused on the idea that perhaps in a universe where certain forces were stronger or weaker than in my home one here, for example, magnetism. What if magnetism was just a little bit stronger? That could have some incredible effects, some devastating effects, but I'm talking very minute amounts. But even so, it's still something that would have an effect. And in my alternate history, Rome discovered the amazing powers and abilities of magnetism first. And so by the time they went to conquer realms beyond what is known today, they ended up with mag rails that went on the roads. They ended up with magnetically launched rockets. They ended up, as you can see, all of a sudden, a lot of technology. They had electricity. Magnetism leads to electricity. Really does. Ask anyone who builds turbines or generators. Or anyone who's spun magnets and copper together, and all of a sudden, what is that? Yes, sparks. Hi. What if they had discovered that first? Would Rome have fallen? And in my musings, I said, what if they didn't? What if they hadn't fallen? What if they had actually survived long enough to build an interstellar empire? What might that look like? And that's part of the fun of doing alternate histories. At the same time, you can have histories. And there was one book I remember, I wish I could, think it was called Dark Imperium. And one of the characters, it was a minor character, very, very minor character, um, was Adolf Hitler. Only he wasn't a madman. He had actually a very different past, a radically different past, starting with his childhood. He was a very different person and ended up being in charge of something like our current United Nations because he was known as a peace bringer and a negotiator. Yeah, that's a little odd. It's almost disturbing. And yet, could it happen somewhere, somewhen? Who am I to say? We talk about how large the universe is. What if this universe is one of an infinite number of them? In which case, everything and anything that we may think of is there, has happened, will happen. These types of suppositions can also go into fantasy. In a fantasy realm, there's a lot of things you can do, including time travel, without having to worry about the paradoxes because you cast a mighty spell as a wizard. And so you're not going to disappear if you accidentally kill one of your ancestors. And, maybe you can, guard against creating terrible events from happening because you tripped over a garbage can and fell on, some guy who was in an alleyway and changed history. Or maybe you're changing history purposely to get rid of an enemy or to prevent someone from becoming a great threat to your realm. These alternate branchings of history are a very interesting exercise in tracking history itself. I like history. I like to read about history. I love that kind of thing because let me tell you something. History is really weird, and history is strange. It's got fiction beat all over the place, including fantasy. It really does. History is an amazing study, and if you know a little bit, you can kind of sit there and go, what might be the general trends in this direction if this had not been discovered? Or if this had been discovered instead. You can look at the history of your favorite fantasy realm, say Lord of the Rings. Look at Middle Earth. Okay. Uh, what if, you know, what if Sauron was banished along with Melkor? Hmm. Okay. So that would have been in the first age, which means half the stuff that happened in the second age would never have occurred. The rings of power wouldn't have been made. But wherever there's a vacuum, something tries to fill it. What might have filled that vacuum? And that's a very interesting question. I don't have the answers to that one, just in case you were wondering. But it is certainly something that's interesting to think about. And a lot of fan fiction I've seen kind of does this. A lot of what they call what ifs. What if? I like what ifs, but only when they're really well thought out. I like to read a good alternate history if it tracks well. If I can see, okay, yeah, that seems reasonable. If I can see the trail of thought in how the history developed. If it's too random or too outlandish, you know, I then I'm not so interested. Um, well, instead of the nuclear bombs being created during World War II, what if they recreated dinosaurs instead? To what purpose? It certainly wouldn't help against the howitzer. Or a Panzer tank, it would not help. It would not have helped. So while that may be a cool idea, World War II dinosaurs, let's just take that one and put it into the realm of fantasy, rather than an alternate history. Although one could have the argument, what if you had an alternate history where the dinosaurs never became extinct? Which, in some ways is true. We call them birds. They're all over the place. They're just not really particularly in charge of anything, except their own lives, which honestly is good for them. It beats some of us, It beats a lot of us. That's sad. So we're going to skip over that. But what if dinosaurs had never gone extinct? What might the repercussions of that have been? The one that immediately comes to mind is that the mammals would never have taken over. They needed the absence of the dinosaurs to fill their evolutionary niches. But you could make other assumptions. Maybe only certain ones survived. That might be interesting enough. Not enough to dominate the ecosystem, but maybe enough to allow, say, us to evolve. And then how would we relate to these creatures that we don't relate to now? What if we evolved alongside them? And wow, there's a nice big what if. Dragons. What if dragons were absolutely real? They're still around. We have dragons flying in the sky every day. You're looking up going, all right, you. Now we have fantasy mixing in with this. Manticores, you know, all kinds of odd things, elves, dwarves, sure, why not? Fill it up. Fill it up. What would New York City be like if it had neighborhoods full of dwarves? That's an interesting thought. Again, that's a fantasy thought. It would certainly create a very different history timeline. Uh, and if we had these things, that might really change history. It's one of the things I'm a little disappointed with when it comes to the whole Hogwarts thing and, the whole, Harry Potter series is if that is true, that would have changed a lot of history. And yet that is not mentioned at all. And I'm curious, what history has this changed? What alternatives have grown from the fact that you have people who can indeed cast spells? And it doesn't seem to be like 4 or 5. It seems like hundreds, thousands even. That's an immense force with the rest of humanity really not having much of a way of fighting back. So how would this have changed our history? And I think greatly so. Greatly so. So again, you can have a lot of fun with alternate histories. You can really enjoy the pathway. And as you've seen from this talk, they do make a nice ambassador with science fiction. They really do. All right, folks, I'm going to end this episode off here, and I'll be back next week. Going to be talking about authors and how much we need a lot of patience and why. So we'll be talking about that next week. Until then, stay safe, keep reading, and I'll see you later. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe and comment.